Before you could send a text, before you could make a phone call, before the radio crackled to life with distant voices, humanity faced a challenge that seems almost impossible to us today. How do you send a message faster than a horse can run? The answer lies in an ingenious collection of technologies that turned light, flags, and towers into the world's first high-speed communication networks. And what's fascinating is that these systems weren't just clever inventions. They were the backbone of empires, the tools that won wars, and the silent language that connected cities across impossible distances. Stay with me, because the story of how we communicated before radio is far more incredible than you might think. Imagine you're standing on a hilltop in 18th century France. The year is 1792, and revolution is tearing the country apart. Armies are moving, borders are threatened, and information means the difference between victory and catastrophe. But here is the problem. A messenger on horseback takes days to travel from Paris to the frontier. By the time the message arrives, everything could have changed. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a matter of national survival. Enter Claude Chappe, a French inventor who is about to change everything. Chappe didn't invent the idea of visual signaling. Humans had been using smoke signals, beacons, and flags for thousands of years, but what he created was something entirely different. A systematic high-speed communication network that could transmit complex messages across hundreds of miles in minutes. The Semaphore telegraph, as it came to be known, was beautifully simple yet remarkably sophisticated. Picture a tall tower with a wooden beam mounted on top. This beam, called a regulator, had two smaller arms attached to its ends, called indicators. By changing the angles of these arms, an operator could create different positions, each representing a letter, number, or code. Chappe's original system had 196 different positions, enough to encode the entire alphabet and create special codes for common words and phrases. Now here's where it gets impressive. These towers weren't isolated. They were built in chains, positioned within sight of each other, typically 5 to 10 miles apart, depending on the terrain. An operator at one tower would set his semaphore arms to a specific position. The operator at the next tower would see this through a telescope, copy the signal, and pass it along to the next station. Like a relay race made of light and shadow, messages could leap across the landscape at speeds that would have seemed like magic to previous generations. The first line connected Paris to Lille, a distance of about 140 miles. It had 15 stations and could transmit a message in approximately 9 minutes. Think about that for a moment. What previously took 2 days by horse could now be accomplished in less time than it takes you to watch this video. The French revolutionary government immediately recognized the military value of this technology. Within years, France had built a network of 556 stations covering nearly 3,000 miles. From his office in Paris, Napoleon could send orders to commanders on distant battlefields and receive responses the same day. This wasn't just a technological achievement. It was a strategic weapon that gave France a significant military advantage over its neighbors. But France wasn't alone in this race for rapid communication. Across the English Channel, the British were developing their own version of the semaphore system. The British design was different, using 6 pivoting shutters arranged in a rectangular frame. By opening and closing these shutters in different combinations, operators could create 64 different signals. The Admiralty was particularly interested because naval warfare depended on coordination and timely intelligence. The British built semaphore chains connecting London to the major naval ports, Portsmouth, Plymouth, and Deal. During the Napoleonic Wars, these lines carried vital information about French fleet movements, weather conditions, and urgent orders from the Admiralty. Ship movements spotted off the coast could be reported to London in minutes, allowing the Royal Navy to respond with unprecedented speed. Now, while semaphore towers were spreading across Europe, another technology was emerging that would prove equally important in different contexts: the heliograph. If semaphore was the technology of towers and mechanical arms, the heliograph was the technology of pure light. The principle was astonishingly simple. Take a mirror, angle it to catch the sun, and reflect that sunlight toward a distant observer. By using a shutter or a second mirror, you could interrupt the beam to create flashes, long and short, that could encode messages using Morse code or other signaling systems. The beauty of the heliograph was its portability and range. While semaphore towers required significant infrastructure, a heliograph was just a mirror on a tripod that a single person could carry. And under ideal conditions, with clear air and good visibility, a heliograph could communicate over distances of 50 miles or more. The military applications were obvious. In the late 19th century, British forces used heliographs extensively in colonial campaigns, particularly in Africa and India. The terrain in these regions was often difficult, with mountains, deserts, and vast distances that made traditional communication nearly impossible. But the sun was plentiful, and that was all a heliograph needed. During the Second Anglo-Afghan War and later campaigns in Sudan and South Africa, heliograph networks allowed commanders to maintain contact across impossible landscapes. American forces also embraced the technology. During the Apache Wars in the southwestern United States, the Army established heliograph networks across Arizona and New Mexico. The clear desert air and mountainous terrain were perfect for this technology. Messages could be flashed from peak to peak, allowing small military detachments to coordinate their movements in pursuit of Apache raiders. One famous heliograph line ran from Fort Keogh in Montana to Fort Custer, a distance of 140 miles, and could transmit messages in remarkably clear conditions. But here's something most people don't realize. Visual signaling wasn't just for military and government use. Ordinary citizens needed ways to communicate too, especially in maritime contexts and within growing cities. This brings us to civic signaling systems that were woven into daily life in ways we've completely forgotten. Consider lighthouses, which were obviously built to warn ships of dangerous coasts, but many lighthouses also served as signaling stations. Harbor masters used flag systems and later light signals to communicate with incoming ships, conveying information about tides, weather, pilot availability, and port conditions. Each port had its own signal code, and ships' captains carried books that decoded these signals. In cities, fire was the great terror of the pre-modern world, and rapid communication could mean the difference between a contained blaze and a citywide catastrophe. Many cities developed civic alarm systems using bells, but some also used visual signals. Fire towers were built at high points, staffed by watchmen who would sound alarms and display flags or lights to indicate the location and severity of fires. These weren't sophisticated encoding systems like military semaphores, but they were vital civic infrastructure that saved countless lives and properties. Railway systems, as they expanded in the 19th century, also developed sophisticated visual signaling. Before telegraph wires ran alongside tracks, railway companies used signal towers and flags to control train movements. Different flag colors and positions indicated whether the track ahead was clear or blocked, whether a train should proceed or stop. These signals had to be absolutely clear and unambiguous because the consequences of miscommunication were catastrophic. The language of railway signals became standardized, creating one of the first universal technical vocabularies of the industrial age. What's remarkable about all these systems, from military semaphores to civic fire alarms, is that they represent humanity's determination to overcome distance and time. We often think of the modern communication revolution as beginning with the telegraph and telephone, but these earlier technologies were equally revolutionary in their own time. They collapsed distances, accelerated decision-making, and created networks that fundamentally changed how societies operated. But these systems also had significant limitations that we need to understand. First, they all depended on line of sight. Fog, rain, darkness, or simply hilly terrain could disrupt or completely shut down communication. The semaphore network in France couldn't operate at night or in bad weather, which meant it was only available about half the time. Heliographs needed sunlight and clear air, useless on cloudy days or in dense forests. Second, these systems required extensive infrastructure and trained operators. Every semaphore tower needed at least 2 operators working in shifts, watching their neighbors' signals through telescopes for hours at a time. The cognitive load was enormous, requiring constant attention and quick, accurate responses. Human error was inevitable, and messages could be garbled as they passed through multiple relay points. Third, capacity was limited. A semaphore line could only carry one message at a time, and even then transmission was relatively slow compared to what would come later. The French semaphore system, at its best, could transmit about 3 symbols per minute. That's fast compared to a horse, but it meant that lengthy messages were impractical. Most communication was done using code books that condensed common phrases and orders into single symbols. And then, almost overnight in historical terms, these technologies became obsolete. The electrical telegraph, first demonstrated practically in the 1830s and 1840s, could operate day and night in any weather through any terrain. Telegraph wires could be buried or strung on poles, independent of hills and sight lines. Messages traveled at the speed of electricity, essentially instantaneous across any distance. The capacity was far greater, and the infrastructure, while still significant, didn't require towers built on every hilltop with operators constantly watching. By the 1850s, telegraph wires were replacing semaphore towers across Europe and North America. The French semaphore network was gradually dismantled, its towers abandoned or converted to other uses. Some stood for decades as curious relics before finally being torn down. The British semaphore lines lasted a bit longer in some locations but were ultimately replaced. The heliograph had a longer life because of its portability and usefulness in remote locations where telegraph wires had yet reached. Military forces continued using heliographs well into the 20th century, particularly in colonial settings and during World War I in certain theaters. But even this technology was eventually superseded by radio, which offered all the benefits of the heliograph, wireless and portable, without requiring sunlight or a line of sight. Yet the story of these technologies isn't just about obsolescence. It's about human ingenuity and our relentless drive to communicate, to share information, to overcome the barriers of distance. The engineers and operators of semaphore networks were solving genuinely hard problems with the tools available to them. They created systems that worked, that delivered real value, that changed history. Napoleon's campaigns were shaped by the speed of semaphore communication. British naval supremacy was enhanced by signal towers along the coast. American westward expansion was facilitated by heliograph networks that connected isolated outposts. These technologies also taught us important lessons that carried forward into later communication systems. The importance of standardization, of creating clear and unambiguous codes, of training operators to high standards, of building redundancy into networks. All these principles were learned and refined in the age of visual signaling. When telegraph operators sat down to their keys, they were inheriting a tradition of disciplined communication that had been developed by semaphore operators. When early radio pioneers designed their systems, they drew on decades of experience in coding and transmitting information rapidly across distances. And there's something else worth noting. These visual communication systems were public in a way that later technologies were not. When you saw a semaphore tower moving its arms, when you witnessed a heliograph flashing from a distant mountain, you were watching communication happen. It was visible, tangible part of the landscape. This created a different relationship between people and technology, a sense of participation in systems that connected communities and nations. Today, our communications are invisible, traveling through fiber optic cables and radio waves we cannot see. We've gained privacy and efficiency, but we've lost that sense of communication as a shared, visible phenomenon. So the next time you send an instant message or make a video call, take a moment to think about those operators standing in semaphore towers adjusting wooden arms to precise angles, or soldiers in the desert angling mirrors to catch the sun just right. They were doing the same thing you're doing. Reaching across distance to connect with another human being, to share information, to coordinate action, to build the networks that hold societies together. The technology has changed beyond recognition, but the fundamental human impulse remains exactly the same. We are, and have always been, a species that communicates, that builds networks, that refuses to accept the limits of distance and time. If this story of early communication technology fascinated you, drop a comment below and let me know what surprised you most about how people communicated before radio. And if you want to explore more curious routes through history and technology, hit that subscribe button. There are so many more incredible stories waiting to be told, and I'd love to have you along for the journey. Until next time, keep exploring the curious roots of history.